My name's Cortland Byer. I work in the research and development department here. And a couple of years ago, we came in contact with a grower in southeastern Iowa that had a drip system put in by a different company, but had pretty bad water and had never made any attempts to clean it out. And as a result, we got involved in trying to clean it out. And after trying multiple things and nothing, at least to date, that was working, we did stumble on these sulfur burners. And here come to find out they've been using them in California for 30 years. There's tens of thousands of machines out there. And not only do these machines clean the lines or keep them clean, but there's a tremendous amount of nutritional benefits to these as well. And there's just going to be some quick points here I want to go over. We're mitigating the loss of fertilizer because of bicarbonates in irrigation water. On our water samples, you're going to see carbonates and bicarbonates, and that's an anion that will tie up cation fertilizer. This will take care of that. Manganese, magnesium, and calcium scale deposits, which is what would typically plug your systems up, which is why we flush with acid. It eliminates that. It increases the functional capacity, the water holding capacity of high CEC soils. It eliminates iron bacteria issues. It gives you the option of lowering high pH soil over time. And it's also a very inexpensive source of sulfate all season long. I kind of feel like I got primed for this just because of the guys that were talking before me have discussed quite a few of these things. But if we look at bicarbonate is it's an anion, and there's a little stick a figure over here of what bicarbonate looks like. This is the stuff that builds up on your faucets at home, the white calcificate. We call it calcium. It's actually the bicarbonate, but it often comes with calcium. But cations, or positively charged ions, like potassium, magnesium, zinc, and other positively charged ions are attracted to this bicarbonate. And because of that, they enter into an ionic relationship, and those become unavailable to the plant. As a rule of thumb, and you can do the math on this, but for every part per million of bicarbonate that you have in your irrigation water, you're going to lose 2 to 3 pounds of cationic fertilizer per acre foot of water that you put on. I did the math. If you've got, let's take this next slide here. This is a good friend of ours in Illinois here, and his irrigation water has, you can't see this, I'm sure, but it has 232 parts per million of bicarbonate. If this is on an 80 and he puts 20 acre feet on, he's going to tie up 11,600 pounds of actual K or ammonia, magnesium. And so sometimes when we put stuff on, we say, well, where's I didn't see a response. Well, some of that's getting tied up in our water. So it does keep the lines clean. Carbonates and bicarbonates come in water, and they come from calcium and magnesium salts. These salts often precipitate in the lines, and that's what plugs emitters if it's left untreated. And that's why an acid flush is performed to keep that clean. But if you use a sulfur burner, you eliminate that need. And not only that, but now that calcium, magnesium, and sulfate become available to the plants as nutrients. And I don't know that I didn't really go over the. I want to go back to this slide here. No, I must be covering it on a future slide. Here it is, right here. So it actually changes your soil structure. This changes the texture of your soil. If you've got magnesium in your clay, you've got these water molecules that want to stick in here. And clay likes to hold on to water, and it doesn't like to let it go. And when clay is dry, it doesn't like to take it on. And that's because of this magnesium inside the clay layers. So what happens when you burn sulfur? Sulfur turns into a gas called sulfur dioxide. And the sulfur burner injects that sulfur dioxide back into the water and produces a form of sulfuric acid. It's a weaker form called sulfurous acid, but nonetheless, it acts like sulfuric acid. And it reacts with the bicarbonate in the water to produce carbon dioxide, which gases off, sulfate, and water. And if you do the mass to moles equation, you'll find that for every pound of sulfur you burn, it's like adding 5 pounds of gypsum, because when you're done, instead of having calcium carbonate or bicarbonate, that leaves and the sulfate attaches to it. And so you have calcium sulfate, which is gypsum. You get 5 pounds of gypsum for every pound of sulfur and 4 pounds of magnesium sulfate for every pound of sulfur. That's either or, depending on if that sulfate binds to calcium or if it binds to magnesium. And then, of course, in conditions where you've got high soil magnesium, that magnesium sulfate becomes a very leachable element and gets drained out of the soil, or gets leached to the lower levels of the soil, and the soil becomes much less sticky. As a matter of fact, a lot of guys, they call it magic mud, because if you get some of that water and you make mud with it, you put your boots in it, that mud doesn't gum up and stick to your boots like the other mud does. It's just kind of interesting stuff. The antimicrobial nature of this water is that some of the SO2, the gas, stays entrained in the water. And as a result, that SO2 gets put out into the field. And as it's going through the lines, any bacteria or fungus will end up dying several different ways. First of all, it destroys the cell wall, and if it enters into the cell, it disrupts protein synthesis and enzymatic function, and of course that leads to cellular death pretty quick. So problems caused by algae, bacteria, and fungus are really mitigated and eliminated when you use a sulfur burner. Again, bringing down high pH soils. If you want to correct your soil to a 6.5, which is a good maintenance level, you can do that. You can also take that pH down to 5.5. You actually can run it down to 2. We don't necessarily recommend that, but you can run this really low, just depending on how much sulfur you're burning. And as a result, over time, you can lower the pH of your soil if that's an issue that you want to work towards. Sulfur costs about 25 cents a pound. That's actual S. And if you look at your other costs of sulfate, this usually runs about half of that cost. Machines typically burn between 5 and 20 pounds an hour, depending on your water, can burn more than that. As you reduce the pH of water, that water can now start carrying a larger ionic load. And so as a result, you can put more fertilizer into your water without it wanting to fall out in precipitation. So that's also very important, especially when you're dealing with water that's maybe not so good and certain types of fertilizers that like to precipitate. Sulfur is OMRI approved, and so it's ready for organic production. So not only are you adding an organic source of sulfur, but you're also keeping your lines clean in an organic way. Pivot ground can benefit from this as well. Problem with pivots, you can only get your pH to about 6.5 before you start wanting to damage the metal in the pivot, and so they like to keep that up a little bit higher. But it works as well. And then of course nutrition, we've been talking about this all day. This graph right here is the uptake of sulfur in corn. You guys have all seen this 100 times. And this is a fairly linear line here with the exception of this little dip right here. And when you irrigate with a sulfur burner, you're putting out a consistent amount of sulfate. And if you think about through the season, a lot of times early on, we're not really irrigating too much. And then as the season goes on, we start irrigating. This line looks very similar to what you might see if you were going to graph an irrigation line as far as how much I was going to irrigate through the year. And so for every gallon of water you put on, you're getting sulfate. And past V10, V14, VT, a lot of this, or some of it, is translocating, but you also have absorption. And so you're giving that plant sulfate all the way to the end, which is what it wants. I pirated this offline from somewhere. This just gives a lot of the uses of sulfur, and it enhances root development, which increases uptake of nutrients. We're going to see that later. Increases plant productivity, helps chlorophyll formation, in turn increasing photosynthesis. It helps to work against stresses, whether the abiotic stress or heat stress. And also it activates different enzymes, proteins, and helps with amino acid formation. A lot of things that sulfur does. And of course, we've talked about that a lot today. So what we did this year was just right out here at the home place, we put 15 pounds of sulfur on with a burner. It took us about 4 days, I think, to put it on. And the first data point that you see here over on the left this is before we put it on. And then we put the sulfur on between point A and point B. These are on soybeans. And you can see that the level then goes up for 2 weeks in a row on sulfur. And phosphorus kind of hangs up a little bit. Potassium stays up and nitrogen stays up. And I think this is really important data here, because not only did the sulfur go up, but it also helped those plants to pull in more nutrients of different kinds, which supports the production of the beans during that time. We haven't run the combine yet, so we'll have to see what that looks like. But as I was looking at these graphs, I had to ask myself, what's the area between these two curves represent? This is with the sulfur and without. What's that area represent in between? And I think it represents potential yield, because we're giving it more and it has more inside of it. So that's just a quick little overview here. I know we're kind of running short on time, but does anybody have any questions about a sulfur burner or? Yeah, that's right. So the question is about running just straight elemental sulfur. So sulfur is a very non-polar atom. And so it's like oil. It doesn't like to mix with water. And as a result, when it gets in the soil, it still likes to stay. And a plant cannot absorb elemental sulfur. It can only absorb sulfate. And so when you put elemental sulfur on your field, you're relying on the bacteria and fungus in the soil actually doing that conversion for you, which can take years. Yep. No, sir. You got to irrigate. Any other questions? First, to use it in the spring?
As a spray water? Yeah. I haven't. I've thought about it. The acid, the water coming out of a sulfur burner is about a pH of 2, so it would burn things. We've seen that even up here where we had an air vent that leaked out in the beans. It burned them. So it's pretty caustic. Gary can attest to that. We've got one running at his place, and he showed us a piece of metal. He had a galvanized bushing, and it ate right through the bushing in a couple days. So it's very caustic. We're excited about the sulfur burners. There's the chemistry that's happening in there, what's going to happen in your soil, the water treatment side of it. One of the reasons that I really like what it brings is the cost of operation. It's a cheap machine to operate. The cost of sulfur is very inexpensive, and it's cheaper than buying sulfur through an AMS product or something like that. Now, if you have plant food, everything we've talked about with the sulfur burner, you basically can do with plant food because you have sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid is typically not cost effective to go buy by itself. Because plant food is a byproduct, it is cost effective. So where that makes sense, definitely another option to look at to do basically the same thing.